Inspirit Nutrition, your brother, your friend, your dietitian, back again for another installment. Books that have changed my life. Let's get it popping. Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery. One of my favorite authors, Naeem Akbar. This is actually my original copy from high school. This is one of the books that changed my life. The truth is that slavery these days, and has always been since the past, it's always been mental. Slavery is mental. The first universal law is what? All is mind, all is mental. Everything is mental, right? So if the mind is free, the body can't be enchained. It can't be enslaved for long. But if you enslave the mind, then you automatically enslave the body. Carter G. Woodson said, if you control a man's thinking, you don't have to worry about his actions. If there is no back door, you don't have to worry about him coming to the front door. His very training, his very belief system, his very psychological slavery will call for him to demand a back door that he can go through. Back door meaning second class, lower class, because he feels he deserves that. This book really blew my mind when I was in high school, because it basically, and look how small it is. It's less than 100 pages, or is it 100 pages? It's less than 100 pages. This is like a pamphlet. It's only like 70 pages, but it was very weighty. Naeem Akbar is a psychologist, psychiatrist. He's a genius. He's a mastermind. Naeem Akbar. This is actually him on the back. So I used to have a club at high school I was president of, and I used to teach and demonstrate from this book because it changed my life. Why did this book change my life? It changed my life because it talked about the remnants of psychological slavery. So some of the things that he touched on are like the concept of ownership. During slavery and some years thereafter, slaves could not own anything. They didn't own the clothes on their back. They didn't own their own time. They didn't own their own children. They didn't own their own religion. They didn't own their own tongue. They didn't own their own food. They didn't own anything. That affected their psychology. They transmitted that psychology down to the children, from the children to the grandchildren. Post-slavery, during the Jim Crowism, sharecropper time periods, the basically indentured servitude in terms of laborers having to sign contracts, the vagrant laws stating like if a black freeman or so-called black freeman was seen walking without a permit or without a job, he was imprisoned and he would be put on in mines, or he would be put on a chain gang where he had to work for basically free, and he was basically and effectively put back into slavery. So there's always this concept of lack of ownership of your own self and your own freedom. And he states that affected blacks or African Americans' concept of property and owning things for themselves and having that worthiness and right to own for themselves. Another thing, I don't necessarily agree with everything that he's saying, but it was interesting. It was stimulating my mind and opened my mind, and it cracked certain chains of psychological slavery. Another thing was talking about the attitude of work. He was saying like work was always directed towards enslavement. Work wasn't honorable or dignified. It wasn't put on a pedestal. It was seen as something forced, something that we didn't necessarily want to do during the time of slavery. Our forefathers didn't want to do during the time of slavery, and that affected us later on, dealing with having dignity in work and enjoying work. Like I said, some of these things I don't necessarily agree with, but some of them I do see what he means and see how they hold up, because the concept of work, there's some people who have things handed to them, and they're okay with that, or they have the concept that it's okay to work for someone else, but they don't have pride in working for themselves, or ownership, something Damon Dash was talking about in the video. And he said one of the other destructive forces that came out of slavery was dealing with slavery's disrespect of African American leadership. So it smashed leadership. When you're dealing with Toussaint Louverture, when you're dealing with Nat Turner, when you're dealing with Frederick Douglass, when you're dealing with Harriet Tubman, when you're dealing with Sojourner Truth, when you're dealing with Gaspar Yanga down in Mexico, you know what I mean? All these brave, when you're dealing with Zumbi de Palmares down in Brazil, when you're dealing with all these different revolutionary leaders, courageous people who fought slavery, who liberate themselves from slavery, when you're dealing with what was her name, Mama from the Maroons in Jamaica, when you're dealing with all these different people, these were leaders that the institution of slavery, the peculiar institution, didn't respect. They cut down, they destroyed, they defamed, they abolished. And so that affected the psychology of leadership, and seeing leadership as something that's beneficial. And later on, leadership wasn't exalted like it should have been in African or African American heritage. Another thing that was brought out of slavery was the clown, the shucker and the jiver, the jester, and the coon, and you see that in today. I mean, I love our comedians. There's nothing wrong with a good laugh, but when they're seen like as that's the mark of a black man, that's the mark of an African American, that's the psychology and the behavior of a black man, that's the worth of a black man. You should be a jester, you should be a jokester, you should be a clown. And you see that in the ways we were portrayed in the media back then, during the minstrel shows. Also, it is stereotyped in television to this day, and it affects the psychology of you have boys aspiring to be this clown figure, as opposed to saying, I'm dignified, I'm worthy of being more of a Paul Robeson, or I'm more of being dignified, and I'm more like a George Washington Carver, or I'm more of something more dignified. So that was another thing that really had me thinking. And then just the overall idea of inferiority. The secret is that slavery has existed since humans have existed. I don't want to say that exactly, but since humans fell from godhood and God-man and divine living into carnal man living, where there's wars and fighting, it's been slavery since then. Slavery happens usually in societies when there's a war in society, one society loses, and people are sold into slavery. The way that the psychology is told in history is like, you're slaves, your ancestors were slaves, and they didn't have any civilization or knowledge prior to slavery. They were just slaves. Really, they were prisoners of war. They either lost in African skirmishes or African fights in the western coast of Africa, and then they were sold, warring tribes, or Europeans and Moors were fighting up along the coast, and they lost. They have the black Latinos, or the Latinos. You could look up Latino or the black Latinos up in Spain and Portugal. The black Jews that were expelled from Spain, the black Moors, the Moors that were expelled from Spain. These people were put into slavery. They're actually the first Africans, so-called blacks, that came over here were the Latinos. A lot of times they were navigators, other times they were slaves. The Latinos were the dark hue Moors up in Spain. So it's a common thing. People have been enslaved since the beginning of time, but they give you this inferiority complex just because your forefathers were enslaved, so you feel like less than, right? And that affects you now because you believe that you're less than. One thing that really blew my mind, though, was the racial, religious imagery and psychological confusion. This is what I did a class on this in one of my clubs, and it was packed. I went to Alexander Hamilton High School. I'm from Los Angeles. I had a club, and we used to announce our club meetings on the intercom in the mornings, once a week, or the day of the club meeting. And it was like 2 or 3 days we met out of the week. But anyway, the point is that we were talking about how the imagery of a white Jesus affects the psychology of the black child or the black teenager. And I remember when I was 16 that I realized there was something wrong with it, because Jesus was born in the Afro-Asiatic region, to Afro-Asiatic line, spoke Afro-Asiatic languages, but he came out with blonde hair and blue eyes. It didn't make any sense. When I was around 16, 17, the time I was reading this book, I started thinking, wait a minute, what the hell is going on here? You have this imagery of God, of divinity, of the child of the Most High, and he looks nothing like me. Not only does he look nothing like me, he actually is a false image, because Not to say that a European couldn't be divine. We're all divine, but Jesus himself, being from the Afro-Asiatic line, from Afro-Asiatic flock, and they painting him as European, it caused confusion. It limits the mind of the African or African American or the Moor or black, whatever you want to say, because it doesn't connect you with the divine. In your head, the image of the divine is European, as opposed to the image of the divine being with you. So these are all psychological chains that were placed and implemented during the time of slavery. But this book shows how to crack the chain. So it talks about color discrimination, how there's certain people who think that they're better because they're a certain color, because they're darker, or because they're lighter, or they think they're inferior because they're darker, or they're lighter. And he breaks those concepts and those belief systems down and say, all that is BS. You can work and have dignity. A lot of people have been enslaved. It's not because you're inferior overall. It's because of a historical event that happened. Disunity, social unrest, political distrust. Different things happen in society and people are enslaved. Lastly, the color discrimination, we're all one, we're all united. It doesn't matter what color you are. And then the racial imagery, you have to deprogram your mind from that and break the chains. It made me start really thinking about chains in general, psychological slavery, and I broke those chains. So that's why that brother Naeem Akbar and that book really changed my life. I started destroying the chains. I stopped praising the white Jesus, Caucasian, Michelangelo's depiction of Jesus. I kind of got out of the method of the mind state that somebody's better because they're light skin or dark skin, or I'm worse because I'm a certain color, or I'm better because I'm a certain color. I got out of that. Also, personal inferiority, the leadership complex. I broke those psychological chains, and that's why that book changed my life. Your brother, your friend, your dietitian, back again for another installment. Peace and blessings.